Hi there, I'm Ed Butler. Welcome to Business Daily from the BBC. Coming up, with the emergence of Omicron, the most infectious COVID variant yet, is this virus now undefeatable?
We've learned to live with measles, we've learned to live with chickenpox, we've learned to live with the plague. And long term, that's what we need to think about with COVID.
And if so, what does that mean for the world's second biggest economy? Is China's zero COVID policy doomed to fail?
The government is obviously very worried because Omicron travels much faster and the Chinese system depends on speed. So the system may not be fast enough.
That's all to come on Business Daily from the BBC. Well, as all those health warnings pouring in from major officials do suggest, Omicron really has changed the calculus around our escape from this pandemic. In just a few weeks, it's gone from being an obscure new variant detected in South Africa to the dominant form of the disease across the United States and many European countries. Omicron accounted for an estimated 90% of COVID infections reported in New York last week, for example. 90%. China. It stood out amongst the world's major economies for adopting a so-called zero COVID strategy, using the toughest restrictive measures to eliminate the virus from the country's population altogether. Yes, it's been painful, but China's health authorities can claim a good deal of success. It's allowed people and businesses to operate comparatively freely over the last 18 months. Is that about to change, though? This week, all 13 million residents of one northern Chinese city, Xi'an, were ordered to stay at home after 52 new cases were found in the city. Well, I've also been speaking about this to the Shanghai-based independent economist Andy Sher. China has recently been facing up to one of the biggest economic tests in years, with the threatened collapse of one of its largest property companies, Evergrande, as well as growing political and economic conflict with Western nations. There's also been the upcoming focus on the Winter Olympics, of course, to be hosted by Beijing in just 2 months from now. I put it to Andy Sher that all of this made the new Omicron wave a particular challenge at the moment for China.
Well, I think that the government is obviously very worried because Omicron travels much faster and the Chinese system depends on speed. It's a mobile phone-based digital surveillance system, but Omicron is 5 times as fast, so the system may not be fast enough.
Would you say that the Chinese economy was more vulnerable now than it was at the start of the pandemic to the risks of a future outbreak?
Well, I think the economy in one way is in better shape. In the manufacturing side, exports are up 30% on very high base. On the other side is the property side. In the last few months, the government has been trying to unwind this property thing. The government feels uncomfortable that so much debt has been piling up because of the property sector. And it makes China very vulnerable to a shock. So they thought that the world was recovering, exports booming. It was a good time to unwind the property bubble. But now it looks like another shock is coming. So timing-wise, it's becoming less convenient than before. So there's a bit of a downside there.
There is a lot of downside, and one would presume that they will go very hard against any future outbreak if it happens.
Oh yeah, they will lock down the whole country if need be. Because the current generation of leadership is staking its legitimacy on controlling the pandemic. So it's more important than the economy, because people tend to have savings. You look at what happened last year, the government didn't give handouts to the people like in other countries. So I think the Chinese people are really resilient, and this gives the government a lot of room to maneuver.
What about the timing of this with the Beijing Olympics?
Obviously, Beijing Olympics is really important to this generation of leadership because the 2008 kind of was China's coming out of party. It happened under the previous generation. So it's their baby, so that's why it's important. And it'll go no matter what. But there are a lot of risks associated with that also. So many people come in. They will be strictly separated from the population, I believe.
You've talked about the politics of all of this, but I guess a lot of it is focused on the fact that at the end of 2022, there is this big party conference, isn't there, at which Xi Jinping is due to be confirmed for an unprecedented third term in office.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. This is the number one priority, that nothing really bad should happen before then. So this is why I think the government will be really hard on the virus, zero tolerance, lockdown, and so forth.
Looking at the property sector specifically, will Omicron make it harder for the authorities to manage the problems they're seeing there if there were a lockdown?
So I think that this wave obviously will depress sentiment. That makes it more difficult for developers to unwind and raise cash to pay back the banks. What the government wants is a soft landing, that construction continues, and the inventory gets sold, and banks can get as much as they could back from the developers. But if people don't show up, and then there will be more losses, I assume.
So will Omicron cause a further decoupling from the global economy, that China is essentially severing itself in many significant ways from the outside world?
I think that in terms of people-to-people interaction, that's being really reduced. I think the political leadership may not be so unhappy about it because they are not sure the foreign influence is that good for stability here. And they don't see a lot of downside because it seems like businesses keep going. Exports are rising enormously by $700 billion this year. That's equal to Japan's total export. So the impact on production is limited.
Eventually, China's going to have to accept that COVID is a part of life, isn't it? Because other countries in the world aren't eliminating COVID. COVID will find its way in. Is it just a question, do you think, that from the Chinese perspective, let's get through the next 12 months and then we will adapt?
I think any reconsideration would only happen after September next year, after the 20th Party Congress, because I think the government doesn't want that debate now.
The Shanghai-based independent economist Andy Scher. Well, of course, there is sure to be plenty more discussion here and across the BBC about China's preparations for its Beijing Olympics, what that could mean for both China's zero-COVID policy and the political controversies around its staging of the event. Do listen out for all of that in the new year from me. For now, though, and my producer Lawrence Knight, take care.